At the end of October 1889, in the Ash Creek Basin Valley in Wyoming Territory, a few miles north of the town of Buffalo, Margaret Hale's horse stable was nothing to draw attention. The weathered wooden roof, the hayloft packed full of dry grass, the two draft horses standing quietly chewing hay like every other afternoon. Passers-by all thought it was just an ordinary frontier farm. No one knew that right under those old planks was a secret bedroom. Just over 2 months later, in early January 1890, the fiercest blizzard in the region would sweep across northern Wyoming, burying fences, clogging chimneys, and turning most of the wooden cabins into iceboxes. At that time, the place that would hold warmth the longest in the entire valley would not be the house with the most firewood, but the small room beneath the stable floor, where the winter wind could not reach. Margaret Hale was 35 years old that year. She had been widowed for nearly 2 years and lived with her 2 children, 11-year-old Ethan and 6-year-old Rose. Her husband, Samuel Hale, had been the one who built stables, repaired roofs, and reinforced houses for the farms around Buffalo. He understood wood, understood wind, and always said that a good house not only created warmth but also knew how to keep it. The winter of 1887 had taken him away because of pneumonia. The following winter had nearly taken Rose too. The little girl had a high fever for many weeks, her hands always ice cold even though the fireplace burned red hot all night. Margaret woke up many times each evening to add more firewood, but every morning the cabin was still so cold that breath turned into smoke. The pile of wood on the porch grew lower and lower, yet the cold showed no sign of retreating. That was when she began to suspect that the problem was not with the fire. One afternoon at the end of October, after feeding the horses, Margaret stayed in the stable longer than usual. The air there was not warm, but it was not as biting as in the cabin. She took off her gloves, placed her palm on the wooden post, then touched the ground. The chill was still there, but stable. She looked up at the thick layer of hay in the loft, at the steady breathing of the horses, at the earthen north wall that blocked nearly all the wind, then bent down to the planks beneath her feet. Everything Samuel had ever done suddenly connected in her mind. The next morning, Margaret brought her husband's old wooden ruler into the stable, knelt in the middle of the plank floor, and used a piece of charcoal to mark the first position. That was the moment the secret room began to be born, even though at that time Margaret herself did not yet know it would become the only place that helped her family survive the coming winter. In early November 1889, Margaret stopped counting the remaining pieces of firewood on the porch. Instead, she began to measure the cold. Every morning before lighting the stove, she placed the thermometer right against the cabin floor, exactly where Rose usually stepped when she first woke up. Outside many days, it was only around 18 degrees F, but the floor was even colder because wind blew through the gaps under the house. In the evening, before turning off the oil lamp, she recorded the amount of wood burned, how long the fire kept the coals glowing, and the number of times Rose coughed during the night. In less than 2 weeks, the numbers began to repeat at an alarming level. The more wood she burned, the faster the room warmed up, but it also cooled down very quickly. Before sunrise, when the fireplace held only a thin layer of red ash, the cold returned as if the fire had never existed. Margaret stared at the notebook for a long time, then wrote a short line on the edge of the paper. Fire does not lose to winter. The house is what is losing. The next morning, instead of taking the axe to split more wood, she walked over to the stable. At first, just a few minutes after feeding the horses. Then it became a full hour. She was not looking for a new idea. She just wanted to understand why that place was always more comfortable than the cabin only less than 20 steps away. The air in the stable was not warm. But the cold did not change too quickly. She took off her gloves, placed them on the wooden post, then bent down to touch the ground. The feeling under her palm was completely different from the house. The next morning she returned at the same time and tried again. The result was almost unchanged. After each rain, Margaret walked around the stable to see where the water flowed and which spots dried first. When the first snow of the season fell, she watched where the snow melted fastest and where it remained white until afternoon. She noticed that water vapor usually clung to the planks near the stable door, but rarely appeared under the thick layer of hay in the loft. Some days she stood silently for nearly half an hour just watching the horses change positions. Finally, she realized that whenever the north wind rose, all 3 of them turned their backs to the wind and stood close to the higher ground area. They did not fight winter. They just avoided the place that lost warmth the fastest. Margaret recorded every detail in her notebook, not as conclusions but as pieces of a puzzle. As each day passed, those pieces fit together a little more. The layer of hay overhead, the earthen floor underfoot, the body heat of the horses, the wind direction, and even the way the snow lay behind the stable all seemed to tell the same story. That afternoon, Margaret sat for a very long time in front of the burning fireplace. For the first time, she was not thinking about having to stock more firewood before winter. She was thinking about a place that could hold on to what the fire had created. The idea of digging a potato cellar flashed up and then disappeared. A storm shelter was not what she needed either. Rose did not need a place to hide for a few hours. The little girl needed a place where she could sleep peacefully through the entire winter. Margaret took Samuel's old wooden ruler over to the stable. She measured the distance between the support posts, the northern ground area, and the space under the hayloft. She was not drawing a shelter, she was drawing a bedroom. A room big enough for 3 small beds, tight enough that the cold would not seep in too quickly, and peaceful enough for the 2 children to wake up without hands cold and stiff like the previous winter. That night, Margaret did not go to sleep right after the 2 children had settled. She spread an old brown paper on the table, placed Samuel's wooden ruler beside it, and drew the same small rectangle over and over. She did not calculate how big the room could be. She only calculated how small it needed to be to hold warmth the best. In the end, she settled on dimensions of about 9 feet wide, 12 feet long, and nearly 7 feet deep. Just enough for 3 narrow beds, an oil lamp, a clothes chest, and a small stove to warm water when needed. The room had to be right under the thickest layer of hay, away from the water trough, away from the stable door, and backed against the northern earthen slope, where winter rarely penetrated. She folded the drawing, tucked it into the Bible, and did not say a word about it to Ethan or Rose. On the morning of November 3, the work began. Margaret dug before sunrise and dug some more after feeding the horses at the end of the afternoon. During the day, from the outside looking in, the stable was as quiet as always. Ethan asked many times to go down and help, but was only allowed to carry small buckets of dirt. Margaret did not want her son standing under a hole in the ground when she was not yet sure about its safety. All the excavated dirt was dumped into the low spots behind the stable and then covered with dry grass. Each day the ground changed only a little, just enough that the neighbors did not notice anything unusual. The first spade strokes went quite quickly. The topsoil was soft because it still held the moisture of autumn. But after just a few days, the spade hit a layer of hard clay so tough that each strike only chipped off small clumps. Margaret switched to Samuel's pointed pickaxe, slowing down but not stopping. By the 9th day, she encountered a large rock that blocked nearly the entire middle of the excavation. If she dug around to the right, the room would shift away from its position under the hayloft. If she tried to pry the rock up, she might cause the stable floor above to collapse. Margaret sat down right next to the rock, brushed off the dirt clinging to its surface, and quietly observed it for quite a while. In the end, she put the shovel away. Instead of moving the rock, she shifted the entire room just a few handstands to keep the rock exactly in its place. What seemed like an obstacle suddenly became part of the future wall. The work continued. The hole grew deeper each day, while the light reaching the bottom became less and less. There were mornings when Margaret had to use the oil lamp just to see the shovel blade clearly. Some days she dug while listening to the sound of horse hooves tapping rhythm right above her head. Every time a horse shifted its foot, she stopped for a few seconds to watch if the ground shook. When there was no sign of trouble, she continued. By the 3rd week, a cold rain that lasted all night left Margaret almost unable to sleep. As soon as it was light, she grabbed the lamp and ran to the stable. At the bottom of the hole, there was only a thin layer of water less than half an inch in the lowest corner. She was not disappointed. On the contrary, that was exactly what she needed to know before the room was finished. Margaret used the shovel to dig a small trench to lead the water toward the lower ground outside the stable, and waited until afternoon. When she returned, the bottom of the hole had dried almost completely. She added another short note to her notebook and continued digging as if nothing had happened. As the days passed, the dirt hole gradually reached the depth she wanted. One afternoon at the end of November, Margaret set the shovel aside, stood still at the bottom of the hole, and looked up at the beams supporting the stable floor above. Through the narrow gaps between the planks, the last light of day filtered down in thin streaks, and the sound of horses chewing hay echoed steadily in the quiet space. For the first time since starting the work, she no longer saw a hole. In Margaret's mind, the room where Ethan and Rose would sleep when winter truly arrived had appeared very clearly. In early December 1889, when the excavation had reached nearly 7 feet, Margaret began the part she believed would decide everything. Digging dirt only created empty space. It was the new walls that would determine whether the room could withstand winter or not. Every morning, after feeding the horses, she pulled the wooden cart down to the creek about a quarter mile from the farm. She chose stones already smoothed by the water, just heavy enough that one person could lift them many times during the day. On the way back, she stopped at the western field and picked up flat stone slabs half buried in the dirt. Ethan followed behind, quietly picking up the smaller ones to fill the gaps. Mother and son always returned before the other farmers went out to the fields. Margaret did not build the walls like erecting a fence. She tilted each stone inward a few degrees so their weight locked them together. The empty gaps were filled with clay mixed with chopped straw and then packed tight with a heavy piece of wood. After every layer of stone about 12 inches high, she always stopped and shook each stone with both hands to test it. If even one stone still moved, she took it out and did it again. She understood that winter did not destroy a wall at its second weakest spot. It always found the weakest point. Nearly 2 weeks later, the 4 walls were closed. Right at that moment, a cold rain that lasted all night swept across Ash Creek Basin. As soon as it grew light, Margaret took the oil lamp down into the hole. She saw a dark streak of clay less than a handspan long in the west corner. Just a small streak, but enough to make her stop. She did not wait for it to dry on its own. Picking up the shovel, Margaret dug outward from the wall and followed the water's path. In less than an hour, she discovered a natural channel on the earthen slope that was directing water straight into the room's corner. That very morning, she redirected the flow with a shallow trench about 8 inches wide, replaced the entire damp clay layer, and packed it again from the beginning. Before backfilling the dirt, she pressed a piece of dry linen cloth into the exact spot she had fixed. The next morning, she returned to check. The cloth was still completely dry. Margaret only wrote one short line in her notebook. Water always finds its way before people. After the walls came the room's floor. Margaret did not make the floor flat like in the cabin. She created a very slight slope, about 1 inch for every 8 feet of length, almost invisible to the naked eye. The lowest corner was dug deeper by nearly 12 inches and then filled with creek gravel. Above that was a layer of fine wood ash and interwoven willow branches to keep the gravel from shifting. When Ethan asked why they had to go to so much trouble, Margaret did not answer. She brought a bucket of water from the well, poured it slowly in the middle of the room floor, and mother and son stood watching together. The water quietly slid toward the low corner, soaked through the gravel layer, and disappeared in just a few minutes. She brought a second bucket. The result was the same. Margaret smiled very slightly. If water can get in, it has to be able to get out too. Ethan did not reply. He only bent down to touch the floor and looked at his mother, with eyes different from the early days. By the end of the week, when standing in the middle of the still empty room, Margaret realized she was no longer thinking about the walls or the floor. She was thinking about only one thing. If the cold could not find a way in, Rose would no longer have to wake up with purple hands like the previous winter. That was the real test that every stone, every spid stroke, and every note in the notebook were all aimed toward. After finishing the room's floor, Margaret paused work for nearly 2 days. She was not in a hurry to place the first beams, but only went down into the hole, sat quietly, and listened. The sound of horse hooves tapping steadily on the stable floor. The sound of wind whistling through the door gaps. The sound of wood creaking slightly whenever the outside temperature dropped below 20 degrees F. Samuel had once said a house always made sounds before it revealed its weak points. On the 3rd day, Margaret began work on the ceiling. The beams were all taken from an old sheep shed that had been knocked down by the wind 2 years earlier. The wood was dry, lighter, and shrank less. She placed them perpendicular to the floor beams above so the load was evenly distributed. The spacing between the beams was kept at nearly 16 inches, enough to bear the weight of the 2 horses, the nearly 3-foot thick layer of hay, and the amount of snow that could cover the roof in midwinter. The load-bearing part used almost no nails. Margaret made simple mortise and tenon joints and locked them with hard wooden pegs. When the frame was complete, Ethan led the 2 horses back and forth above many times. Margaret stood under the room, eyes fixed on the beams. Only a few strands of hay fell down through the plank gaps. No cracking sound, no sagging, She continued with the entrance. Margaret did not want a door that opened straight outside, because every time it was opened in a blizzard, it would let warmth escape. She placed the entrance right under the oat trough in the corner of the stable, where few people stepped. The trapdoor was made from the old planks of the stable floor itself. When closed, the joints almost disappeared into the old wooden floor. Below there was no fixed staircase, but only a wooden ladder that could be pulled down and then leaned against the back wall after use. From the outside looking in, no one would think there was another space beneath their feet. The last task was also the one Margaret worried about the most: air. A room that held heat well could also become a trap if smoke could not escape or there was not enough oxygen. She bought a few old clay pipes in Buffalo, each about 2 feet long. One low pipe brought fresh air in. Another led smoke up along the stable wall and out near the roof, high enough for the wind to create draft but not too exposed. That afternoon, Margaret lit the stove for the first test. In less than 10 minutes, smoke began to roll back down. Rose had just stepped down and started coughing hard. Margaret put out the fire immediately. She did not try again. The next morning, she took apart the entire pipe system, added another vertical section to increase the draft, created a small chamber to let the smoke heat up before exiting, and adjusted the exit angle on the roof again. That afternoon, she lit the fire for the second time. The flame burned steadily. The smoke disappeared into the pipe. After nearly an hour, the air in the room was still clear and easy to breathe. Margaret sat quietly, placed her hand on the stone wall and then on the earthen floor. Everything she had observed for many weeks seemed to be connecting into one single system. The earth slowed the cold. Stone held heat longer than wood. The hay layer reduced loss from above. The airflow went in the right direction. The stove only added the missing heat. She opened Samuel's notebook and wrote one more short line. Holding heat is more important than creating more heat. A few days later, the room was complete. 3 small beds were placed against the walls. The oil lamp hung on an iron hook, the clothes chest neatly set in the corner. Margaret stood in the middle of the room for a very long time, then looked up at the stable ceiling above. Everything she could do was done. The rest only waited for winter to give its own answer. The room was completed in mid-December 1889, but Margaret still did not consider herself successful. She knew a room only truly had value after going through the coldest nights. That evening, for the first time, the mother and 2 children brought their blankets down to sleep under the stable floor. Margaret only lit the stove for about an hour and then let the fire die on its own. Before going to sleep, she hung the thermometer on the stone wall, placed a piece of dry linen cloth in the corner of the room to monitor humidity, and recorded the time the fire was put out in her notebook. The next morning, the first thing she did was not cook breakfast but read the numbers. Outside it was only around 15 degrees F. In the room, the thermometer still held nearly 48 degrees F. Rose slept straight through until morning without coughing once. Ethan woke up first, held out his 2 hands in front of the oil lamp, then smiled because for the first time they were not purple. On the second night, Margaret only burned the stove for 45 minutes. On the third night, she reduced it to 30 minutes. Every morning she recorded the temperature, the amount of wood used, the humidity of the linen cloth, the number of times Rose turned over, and the time the room began to feel chilly. The numbers changed very little. That made Margaret believe she was holding heat rather than just creating it. After nearly a week, Ethan looked around the room and said quietly, "I think we should call this place the quiet room." Margaret only smiled. Indeed, down there you could hardly hear the wind. Only the soft sound of horses shifting their feet on the ceiling and Rose's steady breathing. While Margaret's family gradually got used to the new room, all of Ash Creek Basin began to notice what she was doing. People saw her carrying blankets, mattresses, and clothes down to the stable every evening. They saw Ethan many times carrying the oil lamp following his mother after dark. Before long, the story spread throughout the small town. No one laughed out loud. Most just shook their heads. They called Margaret the woman who lives under the stable. That name carried more pity than mockery. One afternoon, old farmer Caleb Morgan stopped by the fence. He had been through more than 30 winters in Wyoming and only said one sentence: "Dirt is a lot colder than wood." A few days later, Walter Briggs, the owner of the supply store, brought some nails and advised her to go back to sleeping in the cabin before the heavy snow arrived. That weekend, Henry Dawson, who had built many wooden houses around Buffalo, stood for quite a while in the stable and said that an underground room could easily become stuffy if the wind changed direction. Margaret listened to everything. She did not argue with anyone. That evening, she took the lamp down to the room again, sat alone, and checked every corner. An extra wool curtain was hung behind the trapdoor to reduce the cold draft every time the lid was opened. She spread a thin layer of wood ash around the wall corners to absorb any remaining moisture. A small extra vent was opened on the opposite side to keep the air always moving. Gaps only as wide as a fingertip where mice could squeeze through were all sealed with clay, mixed with horsehair. After each change, Margaret tested it for one night and recorded the results in her notebook. Some days she only wrote a few words, some days just a single dash. By the end of the week, after reading all the notes from the beginning of November, she paused her pen for quite a while and then wrote 2 short words at the bottom of the page. Holds better. That was the shortest note throughout the many weeks, but also the one that gave her the most peace of mind. The next afternoon, while adding more hay to the stable loft, Margaret suddenly saw the old mule turn its back completely to the north wind and stand motionless. The 2 horses did the same. She stepped outside. The sky above the Bighorn Mountains was no longer the pale blue of early winter, but had turned to a heavy lead gray. The air suddenly became unusually still. Margaret looked at the horizon for a very long time, then quietly went back into the stable. She did not need anyone to warn her. She knew the real winter had arrived. On the night of January 7, 1890, the first blizzard swept down into Ash Creek Basin from the Bighorn Mountains. By midnight, the north wind had exceeded 40 miles per hour, burying the dirt roads under snow in just a few hours. Margaret did not wait for the cabin door to be buried. As soon as the horses began turning their backs to the wind and the old mule stood motionless against the northern earthen wall, she knew the time had come. Margaret took Ethan and Rose down to the room under the stable, pulled the wooden ladder inside, and closed the trapdoor. Above, she spread the hay back and put the oat trough back in its old position. Just a few minutes later, the sound of wind slamming hard against the stable roof came like continuous waves. On the first night, the room was tested by gusts that kept changing direction. At times, the entire ceiling shook slightly as the weight of the snow piled more on the roof. Ethan looked up at the beams above, while Rose gently squeezed her mother's hand, while still half asleep. Margaret carried the oil lamp and walked slowly around the room once. She placed her hand on the stone wall. Dry, she bent down to the lowest corner, where water had once seeped in during the late autumn rain. Still dry, she stood under the trapdoor and listened. No sound of wood cracking, no smoke blowing back. The airflow was still slow and steady like the previous tests. By the morning of the second day, the stove was only lit for less than 40 minutes, and then put out. Margaret looked at the thermometer. The temperature still held around 50 degrees F, even though outside it had dropped below 0 degrees F. She said nothing, only opened her notebook and added one very short line. Still stable. The third night was the hardest test. Snow had piled nearly 4 feet thick on the stable roof. The sound of wind almost disappeared, giving way to a silent weight pressing down from above. Margaret again placed her hand on each beam. No sign of sagging, no new wind gaps appeared. Rose slept soundly from early evening until morning. When Margaret gently removed the wool glove from her daughter's hand, the small fingers were still warm. She sat quietly for a very long time beside the bed, not because she was tired, but because for the first time since Samuel passed away, she believed that winter would not take anyone else from her family. Meanwhile, across Ash Creek Basin, winter was testing all the remaining houses. Wind forced smoke back down many chimneys. Even the tightest door gaps still whistled with cold drafts. Firewood stocked since autumn quickly ran low as families had to keep the fire going day and night. By the third day, many people began tearing up chairs, wooden shelves, and even spare planks to burn. No one mentioned Margaret anymore. Everyone was trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth in their own house. On the fourth day, Thomas Grady cracked open his cabin door just enough to look over at the Hale farm. The cabin was pitch dark, no smoke. The stable was also silent under the thick snow. He stood looking for a very long time, then wrapped his wool scarf tighter, grabbed his shovel, and walked over in the middle of the blizzard. It took nearly half an hour for Thomas to dig a path to the stable door. Inside there was still the smell of dry grass and the breath of the horses. Just as he was about to turn back, he suddenly heard a very small child's voice echo up from under the floor. "Mom, there's someone up here." A few seconds later, the wooden trapdoor opened slightly. Margaret looked up at Thomas and then pulled the ladder down. He stepped down one rung at a time. The first thing he felt was not the light, but the air. Not hot, not stuffy, just warm enough that his chest no longer ached with every breath. The stove had been out for many hours. On the stone wall, the thermometer still read only 56 degrees F. Outside at that time it was nearly minus 31 degrees F. Rose was still sleeping soundly under the thin wool blanket. Ethan sat reading his father's old book by the small oil lamp. Thomas looked around the room for a very long time but did not ask a single question. Margaret quietly handed him the notebook that had been filled over more than 2 months. He flipped through each page, looking at the temperature lines, the wood amounts, the humidity, and the short notes written in pencil that had worn down. When he closed the notebook, Thomas understood that this room had not beaten the blizzard by luck. It had beaten it through every observation, every test, and every mistake that had been fixed before winter began. That spring, many families in Ash Creek Basin did not dig a room exactly like Margaret's. They only learned the principles. Some built bedrooms half buried underground. Some changed their house foundations, wind directions, or ways to retain heat in their cabins. Many years later, Ethan Hale built the first house on that very piece of land. Under the bedroom was still a half-buried space, constructed according to exactly what he had witnessed as a boy. And Margaret's old notebook was still kept by the family through many generations. On the last page, among the numbers that had faded with time, there were still 2 words written in pencil, as simple as the woman who had written them: holds better.